incoming students, that is applicants, pre-applicants. That's a group that we care about. And increasingly, as the competition for the best, at least, of the potential student population comes near us. So we want to make them feel as welcome and as part of the community as possible before they apply, but certainly once they've applied. If you like their profile, so you'd probably like them to be able to sign up for some summer courses or register for campus activities. So another set of folks that we haven't traditionally in our institutions thought of as part of the home crew and the typical folks that we issue credentials to. Alumni, again, we all have been dealing with these folks for ages, but bringing them closer, bringing them into the community in a more meaningful way, using career tools. These are folks that, again, want to help after they graduate so that they think of us when they're writing their will and make money on campus. Again, keep them in touch, register for campus activities, or buy tickets for the athletic season, all those kinds of things. So just a random sampling of folks that are out beyond the normal boundaries of the activities that we think about, and notice that the resources and services we're trying to provide to them is an expanding list, grows every day. Some of these things are out in the cloud as well. So it becomes our problem. Another dimension of this set of problems is around account linking. It's a way to think of it. Basically saying, all right, at some point in the life cycle of a lot of these folks, we will have issued them our institutional credentials, identity, passwords, and so forth. But there's a period in their life before they knew us and a period after they left. And from our perspective and from theirs, it would be great if we could sort of tie these identities, link them across the sort of transition from one set of credentials to another, and still know them as a single digital identity. The student case, I think, is the classic example of this. Incoming students in many of their cases use a social identifier. There's also a pilot project underway right now called the Commit Project that would essentially, if it develops as is hoped, would mean that at the time you go off to the educational testing service, take the SAT, you would at that point be identity proofed in a good way. They could also issue a credential and an identifier at that point. Then by the time those folks show up to apply or interact with us for summer programs, we've got an identity and a credential set that we can use to get them into our services, but also an identifier that we can link to our internal records when they actually, say, apply, come as students. And at that point, we typically create our own internal net identity institution. And some places at least give sort of net ID for life, but others, and increasingly so, I think, are having this notion of sort of migrating the students off internal credentials, preferably to some sort of self-maintained credential that they can use for ongoing relations to the university. But again, when that transition happens, we don't want to lose all the digital identity information they've built up over time using their identity. So account linking in the student use cases is very clear, but you can see it happening in other areas as well. Research is a good example here. Grad students who start at one place, go off to a summer job, take postdocs. Again, we as an institution would like to keep a line on their identities and know them. Again, they pick up credentials from each of these places. It becomes a problem and a challenge for how we do this. So that's the use cases and some of the sort of follow-on what we need to do to make those use cases work. And really the pain point for all this is that we know very well at this point, most of us, how to do things, serve our students, staff, and faculty that are in the university. But then there's that other world out there where all the people we've been talking about and other kinds of affiliations are out from the point of view of our ability to manage their identities, authenticate them, and so forth. This is again a long-standing problem, and the typical answer in the higher ed space for a decade or so now has been identity federation in common is the one that goes on in the US. There are pretty much national federations on nearly every continent at this point. And the federation space works very well. That is, we can offer services at UW-Madison and let any in-common member universities folks use their local institution credentials to access our services. Likewise with commercial service providers, they can do the same. And they can reach literally millions of students, faculty, and staff this way. But if you look at the problem in the bigger context, as points out here, you've got maybe 450 of the, no doubt, biggest institutions in the US that are already playing this game in the Common Federation. But if you look at the EDUCAUSE list of all the .edus in the country, there's more like 4,000. So not a complete sweep of the kinds of populations that they'd like to serve. All right, well, so this is a set of problems that's already been around for quite a while. How have we traditionally dealt with it? We've traditionally dealt with it through this mechanism of guest system, whatever you tend to call it on your own campus. But the notion is all those folks on the right-hand side that are initially on the outside need to get some form of internal identity. So, well, why not treat them like just another source of identities like our HR and our student system, follow the guest system. So anytime someone on the right needs to get in, we bring them in, get them registered in the guest system, and add them to our identity store. And the only real downside of that, well, one is for the people being brought in as guests, they now have a credential from us that maybe they use if they're, say, a parent once a term or less frequently, perhaps. And so it's a headache for them to have yet another username password. But it's a real headache for the institution that supports this guest registration system. You've got to set up the server infrastructure. You've got to develop the IT resources to set the system up and keep it running. And significantly, you've got to run the help desk to take all those calls when people do forget their password or need it reset or can't remember their security question answers, which all adds up to the fact that this is a hit on scarce resources at the university. Take this approach to things. We'll build our own guest system and run it and issue credentials to everybody that we care about one by one. There is another solution that is really the focus of this presentation, which is this thing called a gateway service. And essentially, it's a way of saying, well, let's take that universe of what we can sometimes call external identity providers or social identity providers, whatever terminology you want to use, but kinds of outfits on the right-hand side here, Twitter and Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, Yahoo, and so forth. Folks have those credentials. They tend to use them, have at least one or a few of those that they use very frequently. So that's wonderful. What if we had a gateway service that essentially to our services and resources made those external credentials look like a federated login? So it made them look like the equivalent of somebody from the University of Chicago logging in. But they're coming from Twitter. So that's the sort of conceptual model we're talking about here. And you can see how that begin to address that problem we're talking about of the kinds of affiliations on the right. Most of those cases would be handled pretty well if we could accept those kinds of credentials without having to turn our whole infrastructure upside down and to say, okay, well, now we have to set up so we can handle OAuth, ID, and several different protocols for this. So that's the notion of a gateway is born. And, so how do you do that? What are the ways that you can move into this space and into a better way of doing things that manages your own guest registration service? Well, lots of ways that you can run your own. A couple of institutions at the top of this list have developed and are running production versions of gateways. There is an in-common pilot out there that is doing this and has been a way for a lot of us to learn mechanics and how this goes, what the trade-offs are, all that sort of thing. So that's great. And underneath a lot of these services, you'll find this package called Simple Sample PHP. It's a wonderfully sort of Swiss Army knife tool for handling authentication in a variety of protocols. and bridging those back over to the SAML world, the Security Assertions Markup Language world that are in common federations that most higher ed and research federations around the world know. So again, to the extent that you're happy building it yourself and running it yourself, you can do that with this gateway idea, and you're off and running. Dietrich's group essentially is offering a commercial service in the cloud to take on that gateway functionality for you. And as you see in some of the screenshots here show, it's set up to allow you to manage that, set it up, tweak it over time from your own institution through a console concept. So it's got the Cirrus Identity Gateway Service has the console for setting things up, an authentication gateway, which is the magic to allow me to use my Twitter credentials and then actually get into SAML app. A configurable discovery service, which is how I essentially tell the university which place I want to go to authenticate. And an invitation service, which is kind of critical, as we'll see, to make sure that we can serve a set of people we want to out of this world of billions of identities that's out there. So, how do we do the configuration of this Cirrus console to meet our needs? So the main screen you get to when you signed up for the service is and got logged into the console. The upper right here is a Cirrus console login. You'll get to a screen that's essentially set up around the concept of organization. That is, an institution typically could be an organization, but it could be even a small sort of startup group, a virtual organization of some kind. But the fundamental notion is that there's an organization that is subscribed to the gateway that will set up a number of admins to take care of the service and further define who gets what. And so the screen you're seeing here essentially is when you initially subscribe, there's a kind of bootstrapping process to get the initial admin in. And then you can add any number of additional admins to the list by filling in the fields on the screen here, name and some email address. This is a kind of critical component in this whole approach to things, is being able to communicate with these folks. And then you create the admin and they show up on the list, and then they can be given particular admin roles through other tools, as we'll see. Another critical thing that you need to be able to manage from the console is your particular institution may say, it's great, I'm happy to use AOL and Google and LinkedIn, but I don't want that Windows Live stuff or whatever. And so you get to pick and choose which identity providers will be able to serve through the gateway for your organization. So that's another kind of fundamental setup step. In this case, we've got pretty much already gateway that you can set up. You've got to do that. Maybe it's by hand by setting a configuration file in single sample PHP, but it's one way or another, you've got to take care of that. So within an organization, you probably have a number of services and resources, some of them local, like in this case, I think you've got a research wiki kind of application that they're running at the university. But again, it could be cloud things, Box, like Google Apps and other things that you're set up through a university account to do. So we need to be able to set up new service providers, and there are, again, a few steps of entering some information. This is an interesting and important one. Basically, you essentially identify the service with a little text string, identifier string, and that's the name that's going to pop up when people start to log in with Facebook and say, you're being asked to do this to get to the services from such at such and such a place. So it's a link for the user to make the link. Who's asking? Why am I trying to do this? So to set up, what you have to do to set up any particular social or external identity provider depends on the service. In the Google case, there are a number of steps that you have to go through. So over here, there's a kind of API setup guide for what you have to do. It involves going out to some web pages, filling in information, getting an API key and a secret, and plugging that into the text boxes. And at that point, you're set up to go. Some of the services are a lot simpler than that, but in any case, that's work that has to be done for any of these. So as we were saying, you probably don't want just to open up our app or our services, ePortfolio or whatever, to anybody in the world that can log in with Twitter or Facebook. So you need some kind of mechanism to give control over who can access a particular service, and that it's labeled in this world an invitation service. So one example of this that's out in the wild is at Brown University. I think they're one of the pioneering places to do this in a pretty significant and well-structured way. So they have a grouper MACE, a grouper invitation subsystem they built out of the pieces, essentially, if you will. And this kind of walks you through some of the steps that go on there. So basically, this is the screen that comes up if you're in the admin for the group service. It says invite external people to participate in groups and invite them by email address, create a message that's going to be sent to those folks, and then specify in the grouper sense what group those invitees get put into, because that's the key then for deciding which services they get. So when you fill in that information, then an email goes out to each of the folks that entered on that list. And essentially it's an invitation email with a link in it that takes you back into the system to sort of complete the registration process. When they hit the link in that email, they're taken to a login screen, a discovery service kind of screen that says, so where would you like to go to authenticate to this guest invitation system and accept the system? In this case, they start to type Google and hit the find that identity provider. And once they authenticate, well, at Google, they're asked, do you want to share this kind of information with the Google folks? Know who you are, your email address, and so forth. So this is the standard OAuth kind of thing, proving sharing of information from one site to another. If they accept that, then they are brought into the Brown system and essentially invited to put in some basic profile information so that Brown knows a little bit more about you than they might get from a typical social provider. So this is self-asserted information, but it's linked to that set of credentials from the outside. So they're asked to enter these other fields, name, and email address again, and submit that, which kind of completes the loop, and magically you are now in. You add it to this role of such and such external users demo. Okay, so that's the Brown system, pretty much leveraging very heavily the grouper functionality. Set up the grouper includes this basic invitation system now as part of the package. So Brown was able to leverage that and put their invitation guest system, if you will, gateway guest system in place. So again, we're talking in particular about the Cirrus identity invitation service, and so we want to look a bit at how that works. So on the console screen, one of the choices is invitation service on the left. When you click that, you get this set of sub-menus, and one of those is invite guests. And in this case, we've got a couple of SPs, service providers, set up within this organization. So there's the Cloud Research Collaboration Wiki and the Alumni Portal. So to set up the invitation service to target one of those particular apps, you make a choice of which one you're talking about. So we're talking in this case about the Cloud Research Collaboration Wiki. And again, we set up the same kinds of information in here, putting in one or more email addresses. And then this is where you can essentially customize the message, the email message that goes out to the invitees. There's kind of a standard one that comes from the service saying, you know, here's this particular service that you might want to offer your folks. And then you can have an individual message from the admin that's setting this up saying, we'd really like you to sign up, and here's why. So, and when that goes out, it's much like the Brown email address. There's a link in it that brings you back in, but there's enough information on this email to, for the person to understand what they're being invited to. Then it's a very familiar process. When that link is clicked by the invitee, again, they're given a list of places that they can can use to authenticate to this guest service, and they pick one. And again, they're given this kind of OAuth prompt saying, here's what's going to be shared if you accept this transaction. We're going to send off to it the same kinds of information, depending again on the social provider in question, to see what's going on there. And it actually, in this case, shares with them the actual information that was sent back by the social provider, Google in this case. And then there's a message saying, you've succeeded, you're now a guest in this cloud research collaboration. And there's a login button on this screen that essentially says, when you click to get to the wiki account will be created essentially at just-in-time provisioning. The account will be created as on your first login. And the wiki will have this information that's made available through this process to set folks up. And from then on, they're in as full-fledged members using whatever credential they did. You can see in this case then why it might be good to have this account linking process that we talked about earlier. That is, it may be that someone came in initially into the research wiki as an outsider using Hotmail. Then let's say they take a consultant role or a research assistant role at the university credentials. If they've already got some wiki spaces and documents built up under an identity, it would be great if we recognize when they transition to a local university credential that it's still them, that material is theirs, they should have the same rights over it. And I know this is one of the features that the CAS service will perform. It's got kind of a built-in social gateways element to it, such that if you log in with multiple accounts, they can be linked. But that's just one of the ways this can be done. I think we're probably in need of a kind of generic linking service that any of us can implement to make this happen on our own campus. But as I say, this is a pretty critical feature for smooth operation across these pretty complicated identity life cycles. So what about the discovery angle here? This is something that's we've gotten a little more savvy about over time. It was pretty brutal in the early days, and not to pick on Penn State because they were really pioneers in this, but they had a gateway from the get-go that essentially kind of gave you this two-tier feel to the discovery process. Discovery meaning where do you want to be set off to authenticate. So basically the typical list that's pretty familiar to you if you've done federated login has the standard in common members on it, but there's also a link in there that says, OpenID providers. And then when you click that one, instead of taking you to a login screen, it takes you to the second discovery screen, which is, if you want OpenID, we support these choices, and now make a second layer choice. And we all know, the more clicks, the more people you lose to things. So it's not great, and it's harder to build accessibility features into something like this that's got multiple tiers. A number of folks have said, well, we've just got to create a discovery service that doesn't create sort of two classes of identity providers. Just brings them in alphabetically so you can type ahead and get the one you want. And the Cirrus Gateway is one of the solutions that does that, not the only one. But in this case, remember we, as part of the admin console, picked the social providers we were going to accept. Another thing you can do in the admin console is say, okay, so I'm willing to accept, of course, Penn State credentials, but I also will accept preferentially, and then you set the order that these things will show up in the drop-down box, Facebook, Twitter. So it was an enhancement for the Cirrus Gateway to support OAuth as well. So beyond Google was able to add the Facebook and Twitter, so that's a relatively recent feature. So with this, it's probably time to step back a second and say, so what kind of mad world are we entering here with these social gateways, and what kinds of risks, cautions are we to keep in mind as we think about this? One of the really significant ones is this that list of providers on the social external side didn't think of themselves and don't think of themselves first and foremost as a It's an authentication service to the world, right? The way we think of our campus identity provider as being. And so it's designed with some constraints that makes perfect sense from the point of view of their way of looking at the world, but can really come back to life in universities. So there's a typical kind of throttling at some level to the number of API calls you can make for authentication events. And if one of your apps on campus is using one of those services very heavily, it might chew up all the available logins for that day, week, month, whatever. At which point you've got a non-functioning system from the point of view of all the other services and all the other users that might want to take advantage of it. And then typically social providers are free to change their terms of use and have done this, not just theoretical, pretty much at any time. So that's an issue. One way to get around some of this throttling is to, we're talking about how it's have orgs at different scales. If you have the organization at the campus scale, you've got lots of services, this might become an issue more quickly. An alternative would be to set up an organization at a department level, even a particular service level, and sort of one service that's got a gateway. So that you're probably going to manage things more successfully. So, but in any case, that's a set of things that you can kind of put in your mind when you're thinking about this. And this is an interesting and challenging area, this business of levels of assurance, that is, how reliably can a service assume that login is associated with a particular identity. And the typical answer that we've come up with in dealing with these external providers and social identities is that pretty weak if you take them across the board. This is an identity that you don't really know much about. No identity proving step from your local perspective, at least in the initial hookup there. And so the notion is, okay, this is great if it's a kind of arm's length relationship. That's not always enough, right? If we've got parents coming in and looking at student records and so forth, dealing with financial aid matters, it's a little more important that you know more reliably who they are. Now, this isn't to say that all social providers are equal and that they all do a terrible job of this business. Some of them do quite a good job, again, probably for their own, well, certainly for their own business reasons, but if you can leverage the fact that they've done a second factor, that they're willing to pass along some information that you can verify independently, this isn't an insoluble problem in all cases, but it is something that you need to keep in mind very seriously looking at it. One of the things that saves it in the model we've been talking about today, to a degree at least, is that there's this invitation step. So somebody on your campus sent out an invitation to a particular email address. Maybe there's enough trust in how that was done, or verification of the email address going back and forth, that it's adequate to the services and resources that you're making available. And at the very least, in any case, you've got this notion of serial identity. You may not be able to tie that login to a particular real living human being, but you can be relatively certain that it's the same one showing up from time to time. But even there are risks. So got to consider the risk elements there and see what works for you. So identifier persistence. How do these people get identified by the external social provider to your system? Coming through this gateway, there's some kind of mapping of the identifier on the Google or Twitter side to some internal ID through the magic of generation and sound. Attribute assertion. The trouble is, again, some of these providers don't really think much about the issue of persistence and the need for persistence of identifiers over time. And so they do things like, okay, Facebook, you can change your username. Twitter, anytime you want to. And the LinkedIn case is an interesting one. If you change the API key, then the identifier looks different than it was when you had a different key. So then you inherit these kinds of challenges of mapping and cross-identifier changes, and it seems like you're back in that horrible world of running your own guest system to some degree, or you can maybe leverage some account linking services if you've got those, but you can see the headaches that come with Google does have a pretty good solution here if you're willing to live with a really long ugly string as the Google identifier. That'll last. So if you can also, like in the Brown case, collect some friendly information like name, preferred name, and so forth, you can say that to folks instead of hello 026543672@gmail.com. So that's an issue again that you just got to think about. If you've been in the ID Federation world in higher ed, you're used to the notion of an eduperson spec and certain kind of ranges of values and styles and syntax of these things. So you kind of come to think of identity attributes as stable and reliable. Well, not so much in the social identity world for the same kinds of reasons. It's not the primary business of those folks to live to our notion of standards about attribute names and attribute meanings and so forth. This is in the gateway that Sears provides and in others, this kind of mapping of identifiers, of attributes from the external representation to the internal one is a configuration step, and these documents here will take you to some information on how that actually works. Mail, which is this kind of siren call attribute of all time in some services out there, use an email address as the permanent identifier. And guess what? It's not even for our own internal populations, but for many of these providers. Mail is going to be a very troublesome kind of attribute to hang much of your hat on. Google, it isn't always something at gmail.com. I can have Hazelton at metazone.info and have that as a Google account. And is that okay? Can you work with identifiers that you can't predict ahead of time? Hopefully so, if you're going to use that. Other services will pass along multi-value email attributes, so you can have 2 or 4 different values, and again, okay, great, I've got that. Now, which one am I supposed to get to or manage? So that's a set of considerations on the other side. Balance that against the challenges of doing it some other way. But I think these observations, caution is really applied to pretty much any kind of gateway solution that has been revved up, at least today. So I think the question really comes down at the end to those initial use cases again. Why would you go this route given the challenges and problems that are out there? Well, getting out of the business of running against management services is a big win for lots of business. It makes it easier. You can see that kind of smooth flow of the invitation process. Makes it easier to get those external folks in. They have a better experience, warmer and fuzzier feelings about the institution, which is what you want. And it gives us a way to go out, reach out beyond that firewall that we saw in the initial slide to those external populations and enhance your collaboration activities and expand access. With that, there's the final slide with links off to some resources about various topics that we've covered here. I would say it's time for questions if there are any, and if I can't answer them, I'll pass them on to Deidre. Yes.
I have one that I already know is pretty much impossible to answer, but anyway. You mentioned in your slides that some of these social identifiers allow the users to change their identity, basically. And also, one of them might actually go away completely. Does your university have anything to sort of mitigate that? Because the problem, of course, being that, say, if you're dealing with alumni and you handed over your federation or your campus identity over to some social identity, and then they are no longer able to use that identity, how can you ever reconcile it? It's 5 years in the future or something like that.
I would put that, if it wasn't on the list of risks, it has to be there. I think it is in the sense that it's this identifier of persistence problem. And there isn't again, because it's not really the business of those providers to worry a lot about that problem on our behalf. It may be the mitigation approach. The only one that I really heard or seen much discussion about is this notion of encouraging people to link multiple accounts. So one of them goes away, there's still a fallback. So I can log in with my NID and Google, and if I lose either one of those, because I've left the university, but I still have. And someone has made that link so that essentially they've got one digital identity and a number of credential layers, essentially, credential clusters for different services. That gives you a kind of anchor point. But I don't know of any more creative answer to that problem that would be interesting in other folks craft one up. That's out there. No. Impossible to answer it, right?
To some degree, it's actually like a self-service password reset. If you have an email address for the user, assuming it's not linked to that identity.
Yeah, but that's basically the problem.
Yeah.
It's very likely to be linked to the identity that has not been.
Yeah. You could also use, I mean, I think the answer is going to be it depends, right? Yeah. But you could also, if you had a trust path to set up the account in the first place, have that person reestablish.
Yeah, so basically with each post, sort of force the user to do both Google and Yahoo or something like that. And hopefully one of them will be there in 5 years.
Well, I was thinking more of the scenario of the sponsor, where the sponsor could basically.
Oh, okay, that could also be true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that presumes that the sponsor becomes aware that that person disappeared. But yes, it's going to be there.
Yeah, it is a sponsor problem, so that seems like a fair.
Any other questions? All right. Well, again, I know Deidre would have preferred to have been here herself, and thank you very much for coming up. On to the next.
Yeah.
He's in Europe. I'm no. Chat.
I mean, it's a topic as much as it is.
It's too bad you look at that. Oh, it's gonna go now. It's gonna go now.
Somewhere, sometime. Me as well.
We go to your news about location.
If I should be gracious.
What
No, everyone's great.
I know the solution, just stop
And I'm gonna go be the director.
Yeah, I'm gonna go do my fishing expedition and see if anybody shows up. I'll call you. Talk to you. Yeah.
You too. I don't like
Not exactly a proper.
No.
But if it's like just me and.
I'm not
I thought it was
interested
a
being a director of those online programs. Online enrollment goes down.
I think anybody who shows up will just spread this.
No thanks. I'd rather have job security.